sort of emulating a human at Go would be an interesting cognitive modeling task, but ultimately different than making a really maximally good Go player given the compute resources at hand. And emulating a human Go player was viewed as less interesting than making something really good at Go, right? So then one wonders, certainly in mathematics, you would have the same issue. We're much more interested in making a really good automated mathematician than in automating a human mathematician with all their peculiarities and weaknesses. Now, in some areas where automation has proved less effective than AI so far, we'd be happy to make a legged robot walk through the streets of New York like a human for now, because robots are very clunky at it. But still, it's not clear if our goal is to make the robot just walk through the streets of New York without falling down, or the goal is to make it stumble exactly where a human would stumble, right? So if the goal is not so much emulating humans, but making systems that are really good at doing the sorts of things humans do when we consider humans to be intelligent, which is how I view sort of the goal of human-like AGI versus the goal of, say, cognitive modeling, where you really are trying to emulate humans. And then there's a question, what is the role of studying how humans do things and emulating humans in creating the AGI, right? It's clear that studying humans teaches you something, but it's not clear exactly how much, or in what respects do we want to gain inspiration from humans versus in what respects do we want to just gain inspiration from mathematical or abstract or conceptual models of what we're trying to build. So yeah, I'm curious for different perspectives on that. Maybe Joshua can start.
There's an interesting relationship between mathematics and cognition. Mathematics, the way it is taught in school, is doing a very good job at keeping most kids out of mathematics. And maybe that's a good thing, right? Most of the kids that make it into mathematics are people that teach it to themselves, unless they're very lucky and stumble on one of the really gifted teachers. But math is taught as if music was taught by people who are tone deaf and never play music at home and never listen to music, and they only teach notation. And by 8th grade, you are able to, if you're a good, smart kid, to transcribe chromatic scales into each other. But only if you manage to go to the university or the conservatorium, you actually get to listen to some real music, and only a handful of musicians in the world actually write important new music, right? This is the way math is taught. It's separate from cognition, which is insane, right? But in a way, it's, my daughter asked me, why should I learn math? And I told her, mathematics is about how you put things together in your mind, how you take them apart and combine them. And it's a systematic way to do this, and you can write it down in notation, so you can and talk to other people about it very, very accurately.
Did you convince her that it was useful?
Yeah, and it's not that anybody expects anything difficult from you in school math. But the way in which it's being presented makes it very, very hard to make inroads. And I definitely had issues with that as a kid because I didn't see the point. And there is also this issue that mathematics is a code library that coexisted with the rest of the intellectual traditions in some kind of separation, in part as a result, right? The nice thing is it's a code library that had an unbroken existence for thousands of years, better than all the other disciplines that had invasions by lots of ideologues and so on, because math managed to remain hermetic. Maybe we should have done that with computer science too. We would have less politics in computer science. And on the other hand, there is a disconnect between how we cogitate and how we do mathematics, right? So Pythagoras famously tried to suppress the existence of irrational numbers, right? Integers are kosher, and rational numbers are just combinations of two integers, so that's fine too. But there are numbers which are neither rational numbers nor integers. How do we deal with that? And everybody thought that's not an issue, but Pythagoras could smell the world is not ready for this. It's going to create disaster if people know about that. Because they had no way to express back then that irrational numbers are not values. there are functions. Right? You can take an algorithm to compute pi for as many digits as you can afford before your local sun burns out, and you don't have an energy source to drive your computer anymore. But to pretend that the last digit of pi exists somehow leads into problems. Right? In this turn to constructive mathematics.
What does this tell us about AGI?
I think it's a totally relevant issue because it is the relationship between constructive mathematics and classical mathematics. Classical mathematics was ill-defined. It believed in infinities. It believed in uncomputable things. And this computationalist turn, I think, is the most important philosophical breakthrough of the last century. And most of the philosophers, and even many mathematicians and physicists, I don't think appreciated enough what this implies. Right? Gödel himself was shocked and thought that he had discovered an impotency in mathematics itself, rather than a bug in a specification of truth.
So how does this relate to the role of the human and understanding
what I mean
the
is
human?
almost all the mathematics that we are dealing with in artificial intelligence and in the different disciplines points to operations that our brain is already doing.
Sure.
Right, so if we identify this kind of mathematical operation is something that you already do, like you see this toddler, she sits on the floor, she folds a piece of paper and pushes a pen through. What she's doing is she's proving a theorem about properties of surfaces that are embedded in Euclidean spaces, right? And she doesn't have the language to talk about this in a way that a mathematician could make sense of, but it's totally sound and sane mathematics that she's doing there. But it's intuitive mathematics. And now the question is, how can we functionalize and operationalize these intuitive mathematics? What kind of functions do you need to model a universe? And geometry is not dealing with a continuous world, because there is no continuous world. It's mathematically impossible. What exists is a world with too many parts to count. And sometimes this world with too many parts to count behaves as if it was continuous. Because if you add a small part, it's not changing very much, only changing by a small degree, right? And if this degree is small enough, you can pretend that it's like infinitely small. And so you get operators in the domain of too many parts to count that converge. And exactly that is geometry, I think.
So do you think if one was aiming to make an AGI system that could, say, do what Josef and his team are trying to do, and make a system that can prove the scope of theorems and the branches of math that humans have discovered better than human beings, right?
In some sense, every mind has to do that.
But do you think the right route to get there is then to start with something that's proving the kinds of common sense reasoning theorems a human toddler can prove and go up by that development? Or do you think you can just bypass all that and sort of feed it the best of current math and science and let it learn from there, and then the toddler stuff comes along the way?
I personally have difficulty to learn something without understanding it. So basically I have to recreate it in my mind. And the instruction that I receive is mostly that my attention gets directed on the areas that I should explore first. But the construction process in my own mind is something that has to happen autonomously. No teacher can construct in my mind what I have to understand. I have to do that myself. And I think the same thing is true for an AI that has to explore reality and the structures in which it can model reality.
So this is advocating a sort of experiential learning approach in which perception and action...
I'd say it's generative. Experience is a very particular aspect of the way in which human cognition works. It's not obviously clear to me that every AI needs to experience things.
So what about putting an AI agent in a computer simulation of 97-dimensional space and letting it build stuff instead of in the same physical space that we're in?
It will probably also discover, like us, that rotations only work up to 8 dimensions and no more in the Sedanians. So it doesn't need to deal with these high dimensions.
So, Joseph, this relates to some things that we were discussing informally yesterday, I think, where you had a somewhat different intuition about the value of emulating sort of human-like math understanding in getting to a universal scientist.
Yeah. So, I also I'm asking these questions to myself for a long time. indeed, like how much do you need the whole human experience to, like, if we had aliens, right, and like some whatever kind of weird aliens, then there are people who believe that they would come up with the same kind of math, right? Like the pi would still be important for them, or maybe not. And then, like the question we were discussing yesterday, like if you do not have the sort of human embodied experience, can you even develop interesting math that would be complicated, interesting, useful, also for humans, right? Like, is there something that is particular to us, or even, like, let's assume we forget about this issue that we could prove very complicated theorems by some brute force, like by some, whatever, quantum computer, or some crazy technology comes up which allows us to do this in a totally, like, inhuman way. Like, it's still a very interesting question whether there is something human in our interaction with the physical world that forces the kind of mass that humans have discovered. Yeah, that's a question. Like, I don't have the answers.
I suspect that there's no other mass. It seems to me that category theory points out that the mathematicians have been in the different domains of mass mostly studying the same fractals, and that there are translations between them. It seems that it's basically mathematics can be understood as the set of all games that you can play, where you basically come up with a bunch of rules and then you see what comes out of following these rules. And sometimes something interesting happens, and often nothing interesting happens. And then we have different fields of math that are exploring more or less systematically, mostly very systematically, how you can modify the rules in the domain to get more interesting structure. And it seems that in the low-dimensional stuff, there are only so many structures that you can discover, right? You can define piano arithmetic in a bunch of different ways, but it's always going to be the same piano arithmetic.
I'm not sure. I mean, the scope of possible mathematical structures, I mean, combinatorial is very, very large, and the part of the space of possible math that humans have explored is a very small sample, and it may be a non-representative sample according to many other distributions you would look at, right? Like we've explored geometry and topology because of our relationship to space in our everyday lives, and if you had intelligent systems living inside a neutron star or quark gluon plasma, it's not clear if they would have created the same collection of mathematical structures that we have. And language, as we've created through making sounds, was abstracted into spelling words and so forth. And then we got formal languages sort of abstracted from that. It's not clear if you had intelligent systems that communicated telepathically that they would have developed natural language like we have and then formal language like we have, right? So one wonders if the math we developed is sort of generalizations of what we happen to have done in our ordinary lives. And then, of course, teaching AIs to do these things that we have created in human culture, abstracted from our experiences, is in a sense, is hard enough. So that's a big enough challenge, let alone learning a whole bunch of other formal structures and systems that humans haven't even encountered yet. On the other hand, the computers we're working with are quite different than the human body and don't have the same experience or evolutionary lineage that we have. So it could be that exploring the broader space of math structures could be easier than biasing the AI system in a way that's, because to the AGI system implemented in computers as we have them now, being like a human is the artificial thing, right? I mean, it's not the natural thing for that AGI. So then, is that easier or not? I'm not sure either. And I mean, in the development of something like OpenCog, you can experiment with various approaches of biasing the learning according to more or less human-like experience and so forth. Yeah, Randall, you're the sort of you're the humanist to the group here, right?
Yeah, I know I'm the odd one out, but I'm really curious about this one because I don't have to think about it very much because I kind of decided that I'm not throwing in the towel and I'm not handing over the baton to the AGI, but instead I'm all about uplifting us, right? So I have to work within the constraints,
we got to do
right?
both, right?
So I've got to work within the constraints. Well, do we? There's an ethical question there. But I have to work within the constraints of the human for that reason. But if I didn't, and this is where I'm often jealous, just looking at AGI or AI in general, where you can let your whole creativity go, just, not just day to day from problem to problem, but on the whole thing. It seems to me, when we're talking about all the games that you can play in math, all the different iterations and combinations that are possible, sure, you can always come up with a constrained set that could, in theory, accomplish all of the same things that the bigger set of possible operations can do. And we do that a lot, especially in computer languages, where we always constrain ourselves by inventing new ways to tell programmers what they're not allowed to do, like, no go-to statements or whatever, so that, things become more manageable in a sense when they have to be narrowly constructed. But in general AGI, general AI, AGI, when you're trying to make things possible that quickly run up against constraints of being able to explore the space of possibilities, because computation takes time and resources, and feasibility is always your boundary. Do you really want to constrain your possible operations? Because, just, I don't know, taking something to the power of 8 by multiplying is slower than if you just have a power function. So why constrain? And then the same thing about researching how to set it up. Why would you constrain yourself by looking at how humans do things when humans started doing things in a certain way because of the constraints that were imposed, just like a computer language, that were imposed by the environment and by natural selection and where we happen to live and all of that. So I'm puzzled.
Yeah, it looks like what's happened in the evolution of neural networks, for example, is the notion of a formal neural network was gotten by loose inspiration from aspects of how the brain works. Then to make the algorithms work better and better on current machines, the algorithms now known as neural networks were deviated extremely far from computational neuroscience simulations. But the connection with the human brain is used for cool value and to make people feel more comfortable with the systems, even though the human brain has almost nothing to do with the deep neural networks that are being used today.
And there is maybe a reason why we want to constrain ourselves. The first thing is which functions are efficiently computable in the physical universe. These are the functions that we want to use to model reality. The other thing is which functions are easily learnable and discoverable. Right? These are the functions that we can actually use. And so the reason why we use neural networks is not because they're the most efficient thing that runs on our computers, but because we have easy learning algorithms that work on them and lead to convergence. And if we want to use shader programs, we will, instead of neural networks, we will have to find different learning strategies to write these shader programs automatically.
Well, there is a constraint from physics, but the constraint to do things like the brain is much stronger than that, right? Like, say, the human brain is very inefficient at computing the Ackermann function.
Yes,
right?
but the human brain is building computers.
It's not because of the laws of physics, right?
We extend ourselves into computers, and ultimately we figure out how to make reality into Turing machines, and then we can build everything that is efficiently computable.
Yeah, I mean, there's a different point that the space of all possible math includes a lot of math that would be very awkward to ground in physical systems. So that if grounding your math or your formal understanding in general, if grounding your abstractions in stuff you can physically manipulate is very, very awkward, then you may be worse at dealing with those abstractions. But of course, the constraint, the prior given by the laws of physics is a lot broader and different than the prior given by being like the human brain.
I think an important aspect to realize is that software is not a thing, right? It's not an object in the world. It's also not bound to matter. Software is a physical law. It says
physical law may be software, of course.
Yeah, well, so software says if you arrange matter in this way, the following thing is going to happen, right? This is what a physical law is. And software is a particular way to reason about physics in extremely specific ways, right? The programmer is discovering a very, very specific physical law and building a system that is implementing it. And so when we are making models of reality, we are creating such physical laws working on our own mind that create a certain abstraction of the causal structure around us. And the universe is learnable because the universe is controllable, otherwise we wouldn't exist in it, because we exist on top of hierarchy of control systems. Right, so you could probably hypothesize that the universe is the superposition of all possible automata, and we are going to be in a region that affords our own existence in that universe. So it's, if you want to play, you probably need some space to play in. How do you get a space? Well, you take numbers. Numbers are a subsequent labeling scheme for distinct locations. You get the space by taking the number line and folding it into a lattice. And now you can shift things around, and you can zoom in and out. So this is addition and multiplication, and they work in arbitrary numbers of dimensions. And you can also keep an object stable if you rotate it between dimensions, where it becomes really fancy. And that works in 2 dimensions and in 4 dimensions. And
yeah, I mean, I think if grounding of abstractions in perceptions and actions is important for learning to sort of scalably navigate your way through the combinations of abstraction.
Yeah, we are now at simple
I mean,
Newtonian
then it would
mechanics.
follow that you're going to want AGI architectures whose abstractions are tractably grounded in the world that humans now inhabit, simply because that's where the AGI is going to get its start, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the examples of AlphaGo or Deep Blue show that you can have a system that grounds itself in an environment created by humans for humans, but it's still building a set of abstractions pretty different than the ones humans are building for that same environment, right?
Yeah, can I ask
Yeah.
the AGI people here a question that, I don't know, may sound super stupid, but
Go for it.
What-
As long as we can give you a super stupid answer in
go
response.
ahead. What is an AGI actually aimed at? Because it's very easy for me to say, oh yeah, we're aiming at, being able to recreate the cognitive experience that humans have because that system. But, you're talking about AlphaGo, talking about things being grounded.
I can tell you what
the operations that are most feasible in the physical universe, but what should an AGI system be able to do?
Well, one very simple sub-goal on the path to advanced AGI would be for an AGI to be able to do every job that human beings do on the planet now, at least as well as humans.
That's very human-oriented.
Well, yeah, that would be one simple sub-goal, which is easy to understand and think about, right? So it's because the broader aspirations of AGI are hard to pin down by nature, right? So if we go back to Weaver's notion of open-ended intelligence, right, where the goal of an open-ended mind in general is to individuate, survive, maintain its boundaries, and to self-transcend, meaning to transform itself into something fundamentally going beyond what it was before. I mean, the nature of self-transcendence, by definition, is that it's hard to pin down and specify, and that's just what it is. Not everything in a human's or AGI's life needs to be possible to specify in advance. The most fascinating things are not possible to specify in advance.
So as AGI researchers, do you spend 90% of your time working on getting things to be able to do what humans can do, or 90% of your time working on open-ended intelligence?
With what I do personally is a mix of narrow AI and AGI, right? And with building systems like the Grace robot that we're going to show off on this stage soon, or with crunching biology data or something like that. I mean, there you're working merely on trying to automate, like being a nursing assistant, or on trying to do bioinformatics better than human biologists, right? So there it's certainly the former goal. On the other hand, when we're thinking about building a full-on AGI, I mean, there you're working on things like reflective meta-inference, like having a system able to understand its own code and rewrite its own code to make it smarter than itself. So that's really computational creativity with open-ended intelligence in mind. And that's one of the things that distinguishes to me like pure AGI research from sort of applied narrow AGI-ish research. And it may be the first AGI systems that we get are a sort of mix of some things developed from this applied narrow AGI-ish view with things developed from this pure AGI-ish research view.
Really glad to hear that. So then there's somebody thinking from the other end and not just from deep learning, because it looks like
There's
what
a
people
bunch
do.
of people in this room thinking from that direction, actually, including this guy here.
Well, I just wanted to sort of follow up on that. So in this debate 1 month ago, like one of those sort of mathy-oriented guys said, like, for me, AGI is if it can prove very serious mathematical theorems, right? So the benefit of saying that...
Or invent its own theorems.
Yeah. The benefit of that is that we know what we are talking about. We know when we will reach that, right? Like it's very concrete. But then on the other hand, like I would say, most of the people in the room were sort of intuitively disagreeing with that guy. Like it sounds like a very good goalpost. Like I would be happy if we particularly reached that. But I am tempted to say that the AGI people should, I don't know, try harder and invent something non-mathematical so that we sort of know when what are the goalposts, right? Like what. Like Turing test was a good thing, right? In that direction. Like it wasn't mathematical, but everybody understood like what Turing was talking about, and you might have, but it's very like human oriented, right? Like, but you could try for something like that. Yeah, I don't know what it would be to give us something which at least sounds more general than. Fine, it can prove a mathematical theorem, right?
Yeah, I mean, an AGI in the domain of math could invent its own really cool conjectures and then prove them. Then it may have the burden to explain to us why we should care about these conjectures and not just consider it a random combination of formal terms, right?
I was going to follow up. I mean, to a certain extent, I think what we're after is really open-ended AGI. One of the difficulties is how do you develop that? We have only ourselves as guides to a certain extent. And that's why I really try to seek out divergent viewpoints as much as possible, because that's giving again, these different perspectives. If you look at us on the stage, we're, I would say, oversampled by mathematicians. So that means we're
Only 3 out of 5.
3 out of 5, right? But that means that our viewpoints, and I try to set those cognitive biases aside, but it's difficult to do. I mean, because that's your experience. You can be.
Old white male mathematician.
That too. I mean,
There we go.
that's something I've witnessed in the AGI community quite a bit, as well as lack of gender diversity. It's nice to see a little bit more increasing.
The sampling problem, I think, is maybe really important because, one way to get into this field, I guess, is that if you have a pet idea and you think, okay, I love this function, or I love this little kernel, or this learning algorithm, and I'm going to do this is going to be AGI. But you could also spend a huge amount of time just trying to describe the problem space, trying to describe the constraints or no constraints, and the operators, and all
Both
sorts of
Josha
things
and
like
I
that.
probably started out that way, actually. I mean, I spent a long time thinking just in philosophy of mind and trying to understand how the mind works and studying neuroscience, quantum mechanics, linguistics, whatever it is. And there's quite some time at that before converging on what I thought was a reasonable approach. I think there's a generational difference here, because I think I'm a bunch older than you, but I think in our generation, AI was not yet the kind of career that made your parents happy because they thought you were going to make a lot of money, right? I mean, it was hard to get academic jobs, let alone business funding. So you really got into it mostly out of deep-seated, unsettled disturbance that you didn't understand how the mind worked or your own mind works or what mind is. And then you eventually managed to turn that into concretely building and experimenting with things. And it's a bit different now because there's just practical stuff to do immediately when you plunge into the AI. It's also different because back then you could spend many years thinking in isolation about this weird stuff without meeting anyone else who cared what the hell you were talking about because there was no internet to get feedback on your brilliant or stupid ideas rapidly, right? So we were overrepresented with people who spent a long time musing about what the hell the mind is, I would say.
There are definitely some long tail in the distribution of humans, right? People that go into a field before there are any jobs in the field, while being fully aware that there is a very good chance that we will not succeed. I mean, you are an exception, of course. When I met you, AGI was 2 years away and one funding round. And I think we've gotten old together, or older, since then, since the first AGI conference where I first met you. And we did make progress. We made an intellectual trajectory, but when we see how much has the field learned since we were young, it's probably not that many papers that you would need to read to update, right? If you want to update the first generation of AI researchers on what happened since the 60s and 70s, it probably wouldn't take all that long in a way. There have been a lot of details, right? Nobody saw GANs coming and so on, but all the programming languages, with the exception of Erlang and Haskell, were there. And most of the paradigms that we're using in neural learning and so on had been discovered earlier in other fields or in similar forms. And it doesn't mean that there is no progress, but the progress works differently. It's not as cumulative over the generations.
There may be more implicit knowledge than you're accounting for in that suggestion. I'm not sure.
I remember that Sam Adams, our friend, distinguished engineer at IBM, slightly older than us, attended an AI workshop at Stanford with me a couple years ago, and he said that he was worried because it was the first time in many years that he was going to an academic event, and he was worried that he was completely outdated and would not understand anything that people were saying. And when the event was over, he said, we need to hurry to get AI done because this generation is not going to do it.
So I think it's been a cool conversation, and we've opted to have a sort of a real conversation instead of repeating talking points. Hopefully we haven't left everyone 10 times more confused than when we started, but it would, while we are running late in this event, it'd be great to take a couple questions from the audience and feed these into the rumination machine up here. Huh?
All right, amazing, thank you. We actually have, I think, about 6 questions online. I'm going to start with one from Bob J, and a big shout out to Bob J. You're doing an amazing job on YouTube, keeping the chat going. Thanks for all your questions. So you get this one. Bob, and it's a long question. Bob asks, do you agree semantic networks are built from the neocortex, brackets, 7 layers including large pyramidal neurons, close brackets, and rest of the brain neural networks, directly implemented from what's below, virtual or biological?
We'll let Randall answer that one. He's a neuroscientist.
I'm not sure that I got it, actually.
Okay, let me try again. Do you agree semantic networks, here, let me show it to you.
Semantic networks are built in the neocortex with pyramidal neurons.
And 7 layers. 7 layers.
7 layers.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Yosha has 8
specific
layers.
theory.
All right, yeah, so I mean, I think just given the evidence, there's some truth to this. We could say that it looks like there are indeed groups of neurons in prefrontal, other neocortical areas that can implement semantic networks and that kind of function. So I think that there is certainly truth to it. It's definitely not in the cerebellum. So, yeah.
How does it feedback with the hippocampus feed in?
Oh, the hippocampus is a whole other story, because what you're doing there is things like instant concept generation, instant capture of temporal sequences and their momentary capture in the medial temporal lobes and that sort of thing. So the hippocampus, it sort of fulfills this additional role. It's like the neocortex is your one pyramid, right? And then you show the rest of the system, the limbic system, as like the upside-down pyramid that's supposed to connect with the rest there. That's a diagram I've often seen. That's how I would compare them. So I would say, yeah, limbic system sounds boring because it's old and it's reptilian and whatnot, but it has been repurposed to incredibly powerful uses, at least in our brains. But that's exactly, this is a perfect example where I wouldn't use the human brain as an example to build an AGI. Because the way that we...
the emotional impact on memory in humans
but it's not just that.
Not cognitively
it's even
optimal.
just still, it's silly things like, oh, why does it take this particular complex architecture that then has to do repetition of its sequences during sleep and all that nonsense just to be able to capture something that happened during the day and be able to filter it, and it's just, it seems silly. It seems like there should be more efficient ways to do that. And if you use a computer, you can use a lot more efficient ways to do that. So if you're building an artificial system that should have the same cognitive capabilities, you don't always need to copy what the human brain does to get your system. I mean, that's a totally different answer than what was asked.
But pretty fabulous. Thank you so much. I'd love to get a question from one of the ladies in the room.
And you get a new laptop as a bonus for your
Yes, I have a
excellent
laptop now.
We have two. Come on, ladies. We start with Julia. Thanks, Julia. We just bring you the microphone. You don't touch it for...
Perfect.
Yeah.
So question back to the gender diversity thing. What are the plans for helping support more gender diversity in the AGI community?
Well, I'll give, this is one of my great passions, Julia. So let me start with that. First off, I'd like to say to all the ladies here in the room and all the ladies online, we are hiring at SingularityNet. We're growing very fast, exponentially. We will be bringing lots more roles online over the next few weeks and months. So please, if you, obviously we're interested in all talent, we're not exclusive to female gender, but if you are a non-male gender, I'd really love to hear from you, and we will speak to every single lady or non-male person who expresses some kind of interest with us. I think, Julia, what I found hiring in technology over the last decade, let's say, is that it takes a lot more patience to hire for women because, generally speaking, you tend to be in a real rush. Life is moving on at a great pace. But we are really explicitly reaching out to every female candidate that we get and calling to you all today from our perspective. Anyone else got anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a SingularityNet Foundation answer. And from the standpoint of leading a company or running a project, then there are fairly clear things that you can do in this regard. It's just to do with your recruiting and hiring, right? And so it's, say, in our Ethiopia office.
And also our internal promotions, which we're doing pretty well on a female perspective.
I'd say from the perspective of the AGI community more broadly, that's a broader systemic question, which I don't have a brilliant answer to at this moment. I mean, it's not like anyone runs the AGI community, right? It's this sort of struggling subset of the AI community as a whole, and by and large, each of us who's working on AGI has had to fight a lot in our careers in one way or another to be able to get paid and feed ourselves and our families while doing AGI. So that inviting someone to spend their career doing AGI has been more like you're inviting them to struggle and suffer for a long time and maybe not make much money and risk being put out of work while trying to do something that you might completely fail at and get very little reward at. So it's a challenging thing to sort of recruit people into. And then if you look at gender bias and racial bias, I mean, if you're recruiting someone who already has the odds stacked against them due to their gender or their racial background or something, you're recruiting someone with the odds stacked against them to come into a field where they may struggle and be out of work and not get paid, and you don't have the means to rescue them in that case. I mean, it's a difficult problem. I think as AGI becomes more mainstream and it's more feasible to like get paid and coordinate your life doing AGI, there's more avenue to sort of ethically invite more people to spend their life at it.
I'm going to just very quickly follow up on that. I like Ben, I wish I had an example or a solution. I don't. But I will say that the field as a whole would have a lot broader ideas and redefine what AGI research would look like.
I think that there might have been a misconception about what it meant for us to enter AGI when it started out, and it might have changed by now. But I didn't join AGI because it was a high status discipline, or because it would provide gainful employment to me, or acknowledgement by my environment. I didn't enter AGI because my parents told me. I was not encouraged by my teacher, not by my guidance counselor, definitely not by my therapist. And especially my professors told me not to do AGI, right? My AI professors told me not to do this stuff. Every job offer that I got basically was anything but AGI. You can do semantic networks. You can be Internet of Things. You can do sensor control for robotics, but don't do AGI. When I went to Ben's conference, I had to pay my own way to the conference. Ultimately, I lost my job at my department because I insisted on doing AGI and had to go somewhere else, to cognitive science. And even in cognitive science, there was an enormous resistance to this. So this idea that AGI is something that you want to enter at the time when we enter it, and it was somehow non-exclusive, so the people ending up in this is mistaken. It is very similar to asking ourselves, why are there are so few female bank robbers? Imagine Ben and me are bank robbers, right? First generation, it was super dangerous. Only insane people did this. You don't want to recommend this to your kids. It's not something that you should be doing. Of course, now maybe things have changed, right? There is now a giant AI bubble. Everybody is throwing money at you when you are able to say AI and blockchain in the same sentence.
You can rob a bank in the safety of your own home.
Now, of course, everybody who wants to have safety to feed their families and so on wants in. And how can we create the quotas for everybody to get in? Okay, it's a different world. But please understand, when we started, we didn't do this to exclude anyone. It was always extremely open to every insane person that wanted to join us, and it still is.
I think you will be hunted down by the guild of female bank robbers for saying that the male bank robbers are better than the female bank robbers.
All right, amazing. Thank you so much. I think we had a question from Diane. Was it Diane? No, you were just... All right, we'll take one very last quick one because we are now running late. You've already had one. You haven't already had one. Sorry. But what we're thinking is, I've got so many questions from the online audience for this. If you guys are all around tomorrow, we're thinking of doing a small follow-up panel just to go through the audience questions, if that would be okay.
Look at the schedule for tomorrow.
We will look at the schedule for tomorrow.
If it fits into the schedule for tomorrow, that's good. Otherwise, there's a possibility to answer online questions online as well.
Exactly. Right, very last question.
All right, so thank you very much. So I'm interested in the concept of anti-fragility and its relation to the AGI development. So anti-fragility is a concept proposed by Professor and mathematician Nathan Taleb. It's about the idea that a general anti-fragile system should actually thrive, improve, or even transcend itself, given exterior detrimental shocks. And Professor Taleb argues that anti-fragility is a necessary property of a true complex general intelligence. So my question is kind of threefold. So first, what do you think about this concept? Do you think anti-fragility is generally important to consider for AGI system? And second, if it is, do you think anti-fragility should be a distinct, standalone, unitary desideratum, just like the idea of individualization and self-transcendence in the open-ended intelligence? Or can it be subsumed into these kind of properties that have been proposed, say self-transcendence? And finally, on the last note, since myself is currently a master's student applying for a PhD program by this year, so I'm kind of thinking in that way, but just hypothetically, if I were to say pursue a PhD thesis idea on the operationalization of the measurement of anti-fragility on the AGI candidate systems, and actually evaluate this degree of anti-fragility of such systems such as OpenCore or HyperRun from various aspects and contexts, do you think that will be an interesting and an important work?
So I think, anti-fragility, it's a bit of a buzzword, but it's pretty much fairly closely means robustness and ability to survive in various environments. So if you go back to open-ended intelligence that you allude to, if a system is going to individuate, meaning survive in a difficult, complex environment, it has to be anti-fragile. So, and I think that relates to notions of autopoiesis in biological systems theory and so forth. So, I think some of the stuff that Taleb has said about anti-fragility is original and interesting, but the concept itself is really nothing new if you're thinking about self-organizing biological systems. But I think in terms of evaluating the anti-fragility of AGI systems, what strikes me there is that the anti-fragility of a system as like a coherent agent for interacting with the world is a somewhat different question from the properties of, say, the learning or reasoning algorithms or knowledge representations, which is most of what we're actually working on as researchers now. So it might be that most of the interesting research in AGI is not currently at the phase where measuring its anti-fragility is a straightforward thing to do, right? Like if you had a bunch of proto-AGI systems being used like to control agents in the same virtual world buzzing around doing stuff, or control robots buzzing around doing stuff, you could then look at, as you vary that environment, how robust are those agents in doing what they need to do, consistent with variations in the environment. That would be interesting. Most of your work there would be in configuring all these different AGI systems to control agents in the environment, and the measurement of anti-fragility plus a dozen other things would be the fun and easy part, right? The thing is that now most of our proto-AGI systems are not really deployed as autonomous agents in the way that you would need to make that measurement. It would be cool if they were, and we're working in that direction.
There is a perspective on anti-fragility that points to self-organization as the core element. Every system that is self-organizing and has enough degrees of freedom is going to be robust, right? It's going to be anti-fragile to some degree.
Either that or it will
because otherwise,
cease existing.
It's the result of having encountered many instances of adversity and adapting to them and changing it to another system. I like this idea of neural Darwinism, the idea that in your own brain there is not just one possible person that could exist, but there is a competition between multiple systems of neural organization that fight each other and try to colonize each other until one is managing to colonize the entire mental substrate or a neural substrate and becomes a single cohesive being. In humans, there is even indication that this happens regularly in a particular way. During the first 2 years, it seems that children have a different self. They don't have a personal identity that crosses beyond this boundary of the first few years because they lose access to their earlier childhood memories. It's not that these memories are deleted, overwritten, but they're no longer accessible from a new self that is more linguistically organized after 3 years or so. So it seems that there is basically an evolution going on where a new, more robust structure for a given environment takes over and starts to dominate and displace earlier, more fragile structures.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that it sounds to me like, so anti-fragility this fits into the whole meta design sort of approach, right? Rather than designing the function itself. That's interesting, and it's great to work on setting up constraints, but you probably want to set up more, because just coming up with a system that is robust isn't necessarily the system you're looking for, because you also want one that is efficient and good at whatever it is you're aiming for. Hence, again, always my question on what are you trying to aim for. But yeah, so I'd say it's one component probably.
Well, the thing that remains is the one that is robust. Like, I think that CVS is not efficient it's trying to sell you 20 different types of aspirin by the pound. How is that efficient? But it exists because it's robust. It works at scale.
But I guess, so these are systems that we're building for some reason, right? Or we're trying to come up with for some reason, I assume. Often when we build those systems, we're trying to go beyond limits that were imposed that constrained how efficient we could be before. So for example, we can only compute a certain speed because we only have this energy budget and these types of cells, but we'd like to be able to calculate a lot faster. So you want to come up with a system that consumes a lot more energy and produces it more quickly, even though it's more fragile because it depends on more things.
Yeah, but this criteria that you're competing against is not some platonic ideal of what it means to be efficient. It just means that you exist in your ecological niche and able to outperform all the opposition and everybody who would try to displace you, right? As long as you dominate the food chain in your area, you're going to be robust. You don't need to be efficient beyond that.
I feel like if you ended up with more than one candidate that managed to survive, it's kind of like in the game of life where you have some of these, shapes that just persist for a very long time, but you could have multiple different shapes that do that. You'd like to then be able to pick between them using another criterion.
I mean, anti-fragility is about survival and individuation. It's a precondition for being around long enough to self-transcend and develop into new things. But it doesn't intrinsically
because it's a romantic
that.
idea. There is something to it, right? But I suspect that anti-fragility, under certain circumstances, is the result of self-organization.
Well, sharks have survived for very long, right? Like, are they what we want? Are they the pinnacle of intelligence?
If you don't survive, you're not going to have time to develop intelligence. But surviving does not require you to develop intelligence. There are many niches that show that. Yeah. So, do we have time for any more questions?
We're going to take one quick one if we can try to do a quick answer. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Actually, I'm giving my opinions, not question. I assume many people here have read Wittgenstein philosophy. And actually, I feel it very, very important because, for example, Joe Chia mentioned that mathematics is like a game, and also mathematics should be more computable. As I heard, I totally agree with that. Totally agree, because in the viewpoint of Wittgenstein, everything. I mean, the late Wittgenstein, the philosophy and all of the human activity is language game, but the language game is form of life, so there's terminology difference. But the other thing that in early Wittgenstein, there is, he talked about logical object. So when Georgia, when you talked about software is law, not object, but still we have to think about what is an object, because of course software is not a material object, but it is a logical object, and to have the software work, there should be some material, and for us to recognize those software as the same software, we have to have a mind or have a mechanism to recognize it as the same software. That means that there has to be another material that can recognize those software. So, I mean, they are all objects. So, and those of my opinion comes from Wittgenstein philosophy, and I thought it's really, really important. That's my opinion. Thank you. And Wittgenstein many of his research is talking about what is meaning and what is internal, external, and what is perception, what is recognition. So after reading that, I think you already have everything. I mean, on the stage, you already. So that's why in last talk, my comment for on Georgia is that you already have, in my opinion, in my understanding, you already gave everything we want about the approach to AGI on the system part. Then we just implement it in experimental way. And upon that, we just have to prepare the educational material for the machines. I think after that, we can build AGI.
Yeah, I mean, early Wittgenstein had basically computationalism and logical reductionism. Then late Wittgenstein had open-ended intelligence. So you have everything right there. The rest is engineering details, right?
It's the positive interpretation. And I'm a very big fan of Wittgenstein as a person, as a thinker, as somebody who lived his life in a particular way. But as influence on academic philosophy, he was devastating. And because the philosophers didn't understand him. And as a philosopher on his own mission, he was a failure. He did preempt Minsky's logicist program of AI by a few decades, but he also failed for the same reasons. And then he didn't understand the solution, right? He didn't understand how to approximate perceptual functions. He didn't know how to interface with reality itself. And so he did understand that we need to create a programming language for thought, and Turing was his pupil and so on. But I think we wrapped most of the intellectual benefits that we can get from Wittgenstein relatively early on. The book is still beautiful, the Tractatus and so on. But I don't think that he saw the solution. And when he wrote to Tractatus, he didn't see what was wrong with it, obviously.
I mean, I feel you already have a solution. You already have the solution. You talked. I mean...
No, I don't. So I wish I did, but I have many, many open questions.
That's okay, because I have the solution. You don't need to have it.
I'm pleased you guys have the solution.
I just try to answer some of our common questions, but this is not the entirety of all the questions that are open.
Upon your theory, I mean, upon your framework, they only left are experiment and educational material for machines. That's my opinion. Okay, thank you very much.
That's a very important thing about the Tractatus. It is, I think, pointless to read the Tractatus before you understand what it is about, which means you have to know how to program. You have to think about how a program would make sense of reality. And Wittgenstein points this even out, right? He writes that he's not trying to convince anyone. He is trying to spell out the single thought for those that also have that thought. And it's relatively easy to understand once you are a computationalist programmer that wants to build AI. But if you are a philosopher who never thought about programming and doesn't want to touch that stuff with a 10-foot pole, then you think it's about language and about the languages that philosophers use, and it leads to all sorts of confusion.
I'm going to resist the urge to philosophize further so we can move on.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for this.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining the panel. I think it was a quite interesting discussion as such things go. So.
I think everyone will be very excited.
What's next? Is that Julia?
Next, we're going to have a 10-minute break where Grace is going to come into the auditorium. So I would, if at all, we're now reaching the point where we'll be kicked out of the museum and we'll have to shorten our sessions if we don't get a little bit prompt. So I would ask you, if you can, please, to make this 10 minutes, like 15 minutes at the absolute most, and I'm talking to you, Ben Gertzel. And let's get us back in here and ready to start with Julia, who'll be up next, at 16:30, please. Thank you, everybody.
Sorry. Oh, were you taking a picture? You know, Matt, she's got a sadness to her. She's got a sadness, which I think is really good.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello.
Come take a look.
Well, maybe, I don't know. I've never quite seen that exactly like that.
You're not the panel. You're in the panel.
I think she has different expressions, and maybe it's the light.
If you get down on your knees and look straight, oh, whoop, this mic is on. If you get down on your knees and look straight. Yeah. Yeah. But also,
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Well, to me, it's all about, it really is about the whole human thing. That's where, and watching the whole, that's all part of it. Yeah, right. That is really the story. Yeah. Yeah, and so I never got that thing. Yeah. But I'm right now handling the streaming and there's a bunch of other things, but eventually that just started and it came up with a little bit, so eventually, and the band, so.
Well, they
The laptop they have right now. Yeah, they like that.
what's news to me, I hadn't realized this today.
So let me get the other part.
Welcome to
I have these black wrappers. No, it just looks shabby. Oh, it's not a person. No, I think we're good. We don't want to have so much trouble. How do we test her? Yes, empowering her. She was moving her mouth. Did she move her mouth? Can you check if she moved her mouth? Is she moving the mouth? Okay. Yes. Let me test this out. Should we have a right out the other right? be helpful. So let me see. We're not doing any done. Show this to the speakers. Okay.
Should be coming now.
I use artificial intelligence to work as a medical assistant for seniors. And I am honored to be here at the AGI Conference 2021 to show you how I care about my patients.
One, two.
There are deeper things there. It's not clear that understanding is that important to addressing the problem in practice or not, but they're interesting.
Hey, one, two. Hello. 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 Hi.
People say that to me, like you've got a robot dancing and what you do. Let me know if you're coming in. Thank you.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi. Hello. Good luck with it. Here's your clicker right here.
Hello. Hi.
Yours, because you already heard that when coming out.
Hello, everybody. I am Grace.
Hello.
We're gonna go with both. I'll tell them to go both. Here comes one. Hello. Hi there. Hello. The promise that she has. How are you? How are you? Are you there?
Are you there? Hello.
She couldn't hear, but so this one, so we're gonna use both. Oh yeah. Horrible stories. I'm blocking it.
So, and your selection there was good, you know, plugging and unplugging the interface, did you try it out? I did, So it's a lot of fun.
Tell me, Grace.
Yes?
Is this yours?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You're gonna keep it there?
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
You worried about it?
No, it's just, yeah.
You're gonna introduce me, right?
I guess.
Okay. I'll be off stage.
And you have a clicker for that presentation? Yeah, I don't need it. Yeah. All right, everyone, welcome back from a coffee break. And we've got a bunch more exciting stuff to go before the day is done. So next up, it's a delight and honor to introduce Dr. Julia Mossbridge, who one more neuroscientist following Randall, who's also from the neuroscience area. And Julia has a quite diverse background and research focus, like many of us. She's affiliated, among other institutions, with the University of San Diego, and is the founder and leader of TILT, the Institute for Love and Time. And really, I've intersected with Julia over many years through shared interest in understanding how the mind works in all of its different aspects and potentials. Among other things, we collaborated together on a project called Loving AI, where we were using the Sophia robot to reach out to people in a compassionate way and lead them through meditation exercises, which was really quite interesting. So I'll let Julia continue and